Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 0 of the Revenue Riders podcast, brought to you by SDS Cloud and Live Data Technologies. I'm Drew Noel. I've got Jason Saltzman with me. What's up, Jason?
Hey Drew, how's it going? Excited to be here for, I guess, what we could call the prologue
Right?
for our podcast adventures here.
100%. No, super cool. Um, yeah, so it's a Monday. I think what we'll probably get into is maybe even a cadence of doing Monday recordings with a Tuesday release, like as if we're actually putting out big scale media content. So that'll be kind of fun. But what you get up to over the weekend?
Had some good riding over the weekend. Little birthday party for my dad, which was just another bike ride down in the Santa Monica Mountains. And then a big sort of send-off ride for one of my former roommates who's moving to London. Ticked off one of the bucket list rides he had on Sunday. Some beach time, enjoying the warmth down here in Santa Barbara. How about you?
Awesome. That's super cool. I actually had my weekend training completely implode on me. So it was kind of funny. I ended up slicing a rear tire about 20 miles into a 5 hour ride. And so it ended up being a 1 mile or 1 hour ride. And I was like, okay, cool. During that time, actually, though, it was funny. I was listening to some pretty good podcast content. Shout out to Tony Holbein, who's got a new podcast with called Super Revenue Bros, which is pretty fun, and was checking that out all the way up until I blew out my rear tire and basically like sprayed sealant all over the road, and then called my wife to come pick me up in the middle of the countryside. So
There you go.
that's how it was. Otherwise, I checked out the Vuelta. So, of course, the Vuelta a España, for those of you who don't know, is the 3 week Grand Tour that happens in Spain. It's very similar to the Tour de France. And, of course, watched a completely terrifying first stage or prologue there, which was just
First two stages.
well, yeah. I mean, there was just gnarly like rain and wet roads and craziness, and it was interesting because all the riders were planning on it being super warm. It ended up being super cold and wet and just kind of a nightmare. What were your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you get a wet start to a Grand Tour, right? I mean, Grand Tour starts are already crazy. Everyone knows that you got to make it through the first few stages upright when rubber's tied down, and the rain only makes that harder. Especially Spanish roads, even in the dry, are super slippery. In 2019, we did a training camp, and on the second day, the first time we hit a roundabout, we had 3 guys go down on
Oh,
what looked like dry roads. So anything to get rid of even more of or to make the traction less, certainly becomes a problem. I mean, you could watch it with the Jayco guys who went down looking like someone threw a bowling ball at them
uh, that was
for that
crazy.
team time trial. And then all the riders protesting yesterday. I think just adds a little bit more flavor to
Uh,
how chaotic it was.
totally. Totally. So, I mean, where we go from here, I mean, it's interesting. Just, I'm thinking about like kind of just on a personal level, like I got to make up for this weekend because I definitely did not get my TSS or training stress in. But I know like also like, where things happening like across the cycling world, like on a personal note, like we've got cyclocross starting in the fall. I'm not racing this year, but I've raced the last 5 seasons. Track season, of course, is closing out right now for those who ride track. The gravel season is like winding down. There's a lot of people in the tech scene in the Bay Area who kind of like participate in uh, gravel overall, and also like in the Denver area, like there's lots of stuff in Colorado on that. That's winding down. So interesting, kind of an interesting time for us to start this podcast, and kind of the themes that slide into that, and kind of overlap between our mutual interests. And yeah, I mean, I think with that, like, we should probably get into telling people what Revenue Riders is all about, right? Like, what is this? What, it's like, wait a minute, like, these two guys who are in tech, they're talking about, cycling, they're talking about endurance sport, like, they're talking about the pro cycling scene. What's going on here? So, from your perspective, and I know that we've talked about this a lot, just kind of bringing this to market, and theorizing, the concept of this podcast. But, for you, like, what does Revenue Riders really mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe backing up and explaining how the two of us know each other,
Sure.
is maybe the start of this. Combining the tech and the bike, and sort of work bike balance.
Sure.
I think we originally connected on LinkedIn, in the random way that networking works. And Drew was doing a little bit of a road show, working with some of the SCS clients, and was passing through Santa Barbara and posted something about, hey, does anyone want to ride? Or does anyone know someone I should ride with? And I saw it, and one somewhat foggy Sunday morning, we went out and did what I thought was a coffee ride, and Drew maybe thought was a bike race. And got to talking and realized that a lot of the way that both of us understand the world, whether that's the bike world, our day-to-day lives, or the business world, is through this framework that we've gotten from the endurance athletics world. And we've really been able to sort of translate that and map the two, being endurance athletics and business, not maybe one for one, but pretty close. And there's a lot that we've taken, and we sort of just wanted to dive into that and have some guests on, talk about it, and see how everyone else, the whole myriad of people that have made some transition from endurance sports to business, or from business to endurance sports, or have been able to combine the two.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fun because the big thing for me, and the when you and I met up in Santa Barbara, it was great because we're sitting there at Handlebar Coffee Roasters, right? And shout out to them as well, because it's like just such a killer spot, in terms of California cycling and coffee. But just sitting there, and I've been thinking about building out this podcast. I discussed it with Derek, my CEO, and like sharing it with you, and just seeing like that there was this correlation in terms of our viewpoints of really looking and using cycling and endurance sport as a framework, as a metaphor. And it's funny because I want to call out Andy Mewborn, who's been a mentor for me, like in terms of just my LinkedIn content and like getting myself out there, in terms of networking and producing content overall. And it's funny because he always says that clear is better than clever, and it's kind of like one of the things that I slightly disagree on, because it's so much more fun to like have a metaphor to work with, and to really like put that together, and to use it as a way to communicate other ideas or delve into deeper ideas. And in this case, we'll be using the endurance sport metaphor, or performance metaphors to dive into particular aspects of business, and then vice versa, speaking with other people who either have a passion around business performance, or even are an athlete in their personal lives, or a professional athlete outside of their day jobs, right? To actually discuss the interplay and the interconnection between endurance sport and being successful in one's career and business undertakings. So I think it's going to be super cool. A lot of ideas that kind of come from that. And I think also, one thing that, are the primary correlations is that if you have clear targets or inputs, right, it's really like those outputs or, continuously looking at the performance or conversion toward wins and the probabilities related to all of that. It's the same in endurance sport as it is in business, right? So, as you're looking for that efficiency, you're looking for that performance or that output. The inputs are always, those things that you need to analyze and evaluate. How do you actually get more out of the engine? Um, Same with, business. Same with your body. So, a lot of interplay there. Any other thoughts on that, Jason? Before we jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a lot of it is thinking about it in terms of, you know, at the end of the day, it's figuring out you know, where you want to go and how you're going to get there and embracing sort of the broad middle of, all the training and the hard work and, sort of the repetitive nature of the stuff that has to get done sort of between here and whatever the outcome you're looking for is, whether that's a deal cycle, whether that's building a company, whether that's any of the number of things that happen in the business world, as these positive outcomes we all aim for. Thinking about it the same way I would at least, training for a race and training for a season and thinking about the broader picture there. But it's all about the figuring out what works and sort of just getting it done.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that provides a perfect transition to kind of talk about our respective backgrounds, and I really want to I think that I know that in our discussions earlier you kind of like said like well I'm not the best self promoter, but I'm like, well, I'll be your hype man then, and just basically be like, the fact that you've actually been a professional cyclist, the fact that you were a continental racer in Europe, and really committed to doing that, as well as you have significant palmares in the United States prior to that as well. And now of course you've transitioned and moved into a professional career as a business person, and as a growth marketer. Uh, Want to hear about that. Tell us about the journey to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this takes the step back and thinking about that pathway. Um, Hindsight's 2020. It all seems to stack up pretty well now. But started racing. Grew up in the Bay Area. I mean, my running joke now is I grew up a few blocks from Sand Hill Road. There's something in the water up there about startups and all of the companies that you can name that came out of Menlo Park or Palo Alto or the greater Silicon Valley. And just being around that growing up, I think creates an environment. I think the cliche is you go where the action is. And I think that later in my story that translates to why I went and raced in Europe, and was I saw that that was the place to go to really test myself, prove myself, and sort of be around people that would push me, and have sort of the velocity of things happening to you know really make sure I got the most out of myself. Um, and then grew up in the Bay Area. Started racing from a very young age. My parents met racing in college. No one ever forced me on a bike, but there was always a bike around, and when that was sort of the de facto family activity on the weekend, the bug bit pretty quickly. You know, Started racing and wasn't very good. And I actually think that was a bit of a blessing later down in my, later down the line in my career. It taught me, I had to learn how to race as opposed to how to ride really hard. Because when other people are just faster, you have to, sort of learn some of the racecraft, and be sneakier about it. Figure out how to save energy and hide out of the wind. I mean, my first race, I got lapped twice, by people who then, a few years later, once everything, I had some training in the legs and puberty leveled off, I started to beat in some of the local junior races and some of the national level junior races. Worked my way through the national, international ranks as a junior, and then turned pro my senior year of high school, and then parallel pathed a 6 years racing at the continental level with a college career. Went to Claremont McKenna, studied economics and psychology. Right, my problem with traditional econ is the assumption of rationality, because I've never met someone who makes decisions rationally, myself included. Um, and really got into a sequence or cycle where I was going to school in the fall, taking the spring off to go race my bike all around the world because it's a little bit hard to be in Italy and Southern California at the same time. And then spent uh, my last year as an under 23 racing in Italy. Got to race against, I think I tallied it up that year, at the end of the year, that 54 guys or 56 guys I raced against that year went World Tour or Pro Conti. And I think that to the point earlier of going where the action is, that certainly proved my point there and gave me some confidence that if I took another stab at it, I could at least play in that arena. Went back across to Europe in 2020 to race for an Austrian team. The world shut down. There wasn't that much bike racing. It was a very long training camp, in a beautiful part of the world. And then got a chance to ride with Wildlife in 2021. Raced mostly internationally. Again in Rwanda, Romania, Turkey, and really got the chance to race against some of the best guys in the world. Former Tour de France stage winners, Olympians, world champions, etc. And figured out that the cross product of my genetics and hard work was at a certain level and as hard as I wanted to work. Some other guys had better genetics than I did, and got to answer the question I didn't want to have 15 years from now sitting behind a desk somewhere of what maybe could have been, and got by the time the end of the 2021 season came around, was sort of at peace with where I got to in the sport, everything I'd accomplished, and still loved the bike, which to me was one of the big things. I know a lot of guys I raced against over the years that left the sport and haven't touched a bike in a decade now, and now I to sort of come full circle, right? The bike has connected me to people like Drew and to all sorts of other people. Actually, the running joke is that I think I've gotten at least I'm at live data partially because of cycling, right? Scott, my CEO's initial outreach to me, had a little PS at the bottom of a LinkedIn message that said, "PS, I was a Cat 2 cyclist back in the day." And I can look across the room here and see a bike in his office right now. So certainly lots of lessons learned from a racing career that we'll dive into over the course of this podcast, that translate into my vocational job now. But also certainly lots of relationships and lots of people that mean a lot and have taught me a lot over the years, including going all the way back to those people in the Silicon Valley as a 13-year-old on group rides that you're brushing shoulders with VCs and Fortune 500 execs and all the rest, and it becomes an education of its own.
Spectrum or like the Nooner, like
Yep.
the
Both.
famous rides.
Spectrum, Nooner, Morning Ride, all of them. I mean, you can look. You can, if you created a roster of all the people on those rides, you'd probably come up with a few $1 billion worth of wealth or company value at this point. So,
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It is interesting, and to your point, when we first rode together, it was fascinating because you and I agreed that cycling, and we've seen this written places. It's been mentioned, I think, even in the New York Times, but cycling is the new golf, right?
I mean, that's what I wanted to call the podcast.
I know, right?
So,
But it's funny because that aspect of networking, like you said, and I think what's fascinating is that if you're reasonably well paired and you're enjoying a bike ride with another person, you're really able to get a feel for the type of person that person is, the way they conduct themselves, the way they work within themselves, the way they carry on a conversation while they're under a certain amount of duress, um, as you put me under in our initial ride. Uh, and then just also their appreciation for like you said, sort of the balance of life, right? And not only are they staring maybe at their head unit or their computer, but they're also looking up to notice the view, or a beautiful tree, or a particular bend in the road, um, and highlighting those points as well. So it's pretty fascinating that way. Um, it's funny since like I've had like a semi-militant view myself about oh well, like I don't play golf anymore, I ride bikes. It's funny because I actually went to the driving range this last week because I actually have a golf social coming up, but I was like, oh, it would just be so cool if we could just figure out how to do like a massive group ride instead. But like, it's not necessarily
Certainly what I would pick.
for all people. So yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um,
super cool.
yeah,
Um,
and I mean, well, I think getting a bit of your background now, digging into both your history on the bike and what you're up to, where you got in the business world,
yeah, yeah,
can be good
absolutely.
to.
So for me, I mean, I'm a competitive cyclist myself. Masters Cat 3, which there's plenty of jokes that could be made about that. But earnestly working towards fitness so that I can get my Cat 2 over the next year or two. So matching up with your CEO over there, and then I think that's an interesting aspect as well. One of the things that I really appreciate about my work environment is that my CEO and COO are both endurance athletes. One's a mountain biker and one's a triathlete. So they get it. They understand, the training aspect, but I think that also carries over into their work lives, in terms of the focus, endurance, and rigor with which they pursue their professions. And I really appreciate that about the team here at SES Cloud. Um, I think also, from me and my background, I've always been I I've, I've been a marketer, a seller. I've also been very focused on the ops side of those actions, and always very in revenue, CRM, analytics for the last 20 plus years. So the interesting thing about me is that I've kind of been all over the place. So I've done all levels, multiple industries. I've been at partner shops. I've been at a vendor, and then I've also been in house, and done consulting a couple of different ways. And then I think really RevOps, in my opinion, is sort of the underpinning, or performance or efficiency focus of the revenue engine of the organization. And also, it's funny because you and I were kicking this back and forth, but in cycling, there's the concept, especially in professional cycling, there's the concept of the domestique, right? Which is the worker, that specifically supports the team leader within a professional team, and from that view, RevOps is really the domestique to marketing, sales, CS, and the CEO potentially. And so I think that's an interesting aspect, being able to produce at a very high level, but also not necessarily always be the star of the show, but really buttress and support the execution of the organization in a way that leads to force multiplication and efficiencies, is a super critical factor, and something that I love to highlight about my professional career. But then, also like, this has kind of led into the entrepreneurial aspect. I've been at a number of startups, Series A, Series C, Series E, just kind of all different ranges in the startup world. And then also, just also been involved in starting up community and engagement in the cycling world as well. I've started a cycling team myself. I run that for a number of years in USA Cycling in Northern California, Nevada Cycling Association. So, really like done that whole thing, which of course you're an alum of the NCNCA yourself. So that's pretty cool. And then, currently getting ready to create a new team concept and probably bring that to the cycling community in the next 1 to 2 years as well. So working on that, and really wanted to be able to have those conversations, share my personal perspective with my business perspective, and I think what's really cool is you and I met up and we're able to give each other that opportunity, as well as I think our community overall, both business and endurance sport. So I think it'll be really fun to kind of take that and have those conversations on an ongoing basis. Cool. So wanted to just
Yeah.
quickly pause and just give props and a shout out one more time to uh, our employers, STS Cloud and Live Data Technologies, for effectively like being the de facto sponsors of the current Revenue Riders podcast.
Yeah,
Um,
we're sat here doing this during the workday, so
right, exactly. It's a
counts as
Monday.
some form of
It's a
sponsorship.
Monday afternoon. We're making content, so we're very lucky to be able to do that. I think it's pretty rad. So thanks to our teams and to our companies for effectively sponsoring. So pretty rad. Um, so Jason, I wanted to get into kind of the way that we kind of looked at the way the conversations can be informed. As we build out this content, as we create a community for our listeners, and really, in terms of how we format the conversations with our guests. So I think the two different things that I think would be really cool to talk about, kind of the format of the show going forward, and to give our listeners an idea of the future content is, first off, there's a compare and contrast aspect to both you and I, and also like the way that we'd like to inform the show, and then also the intended format of the show overall. And I think it'll be interesting to kind of give an idea of the types of things we'd like to talk about, how we'd like to format the show, and what our listeners could expect on an ongoing basis. So I mean, first off, I'll just call it out like very, very, simply, pro versus amateur, right? Like, as cyclists, you've actually been a professional. I've always been an amateur, except maybe you could say like the 5 months I was a courier in San Francisco. You could say maybe I was like a professional cyclist, for those 5 months, but not in a racing capacity, right? And not necessarily in a performance capacity. So I think that's a really interesting point to start, right? And I think that maybe speaks to our audience around the aspect that everybody's where they are, right, in terms of their overall progression. Everybody has their own viewpoint, and there shouldn't be an idea that you can't speak to your own viewpoint, as long as you're willing to acknowledge, like, yeah, like in certain things, especially when it gets to super technical points of training, I've always been an amateur, right? But I do structured training. I have my approach. I've studied it to a degree, but absolutely, you may be absolutely by far much more expert in those particular aspects. And I think that actually leads to just that differential, right? Leads to interesting conversation. So I think, that's kind of point one, is the compare contrast aspect of pro versus amateur. And I think that maybe extends also to the professional world, is that, in our community or our listenership, as we build this out, I think people need to be, completely willing to engage with us, regardless of, whether they're like, oh, well, I know this really well or I don't. We're super interested to engage with anybody, regardless of their professional level or their depth of experience. And I think that that's a super cool factor to check out. So that's kind of point one of the compare and contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think, digging into that a little bit more, right? Just thinking about it from the, professional maybe means some level of achievement, but, I think the best thing that any of us can be is amateur in our approach, not in the, like, we don't take it seriously, but in the, we're constantly learning. There's always something else to get better at and to improve, right? Professional, can be professional in the execution of things, but amateur in the mindset of I can always get better. And then I guess the next point to compare and contrast on is really taking the approach of the growth versus revenue side of things. Maybe now I'm going to start confusing the word professional a bunch. But in our professional lives, I sit more firmly on the marketing, demand gen, growth side of things. And you really sit more on the execution and ops sides of things. Sort of, as you said, thinking about it in terms of to make my maybe first cycling analogy of this series. You're the domestique sitting in the wind all day. I'm the lead out guy, and our sales guys are the sprinters. There's some version there that really starts to paint a picture of how we operate. And what each of us do in our day-to-days and how we approach it. So I'd say that's the second piece or second comparison to draw.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then I mean, we can also look at sort of top of funnel, middle of funnel, and bottom of funnel as well, right? Like, with growth and demand gen being much more top of funnel, but also bridging into that early mid funnel, and then of course revenue and sales being much more focused in terms of the mid funnel and bottom of funnel. And then, again, it's so interesting because it really does make me think of like the Legion lead out train videos that like from a few years ago, which are like so awesome because it's just like everybody doing like 1200 plus watts, like just going super hard into a sprint training like lead out, and that is a corollary to the funnel, right? Like you're carrying that effort or that energy through a particular point, and then effectively handing it off, and the next person is taking on that effort, the next part of the organization is taking on that effort. And it's funny because like you could totally see that just within a particular lead out train. So I think it's really interesting to kind of that tip of the spear or domestique format, and then of course the team wins overall by everybody's collective efforts. So pretty cool there. Yeah, I mean, what else do you think, like in terms of the differentials or the compare and contrast aspect that we can potentially offer our listeners and viewers, as well as just facilitate conversations with our guests?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other obvious one here is that you're more established in your career here, right? Maybe a little bit in the opposite of how it plays out on the bike. You've had more experiences and had more just career growth. Even just by a function of years and timeline than I have. Just taking different sets of insights from mid-career and early career and seeing how those stack up, and hopefully we'll get the chance to have some guests on that have had even more experience and certainly in other domains to really build that picture, right? I think of it in, now I'm going to keep going down the different analogy rabbit holes here, but you have the old guy who's been on the team forever and the young guy that just came out of the under 23 ranks, and maybe you have the DS that we have on as one of our guests. There's all sorts of ways to look at this and think about the different ways that you can sort of get the perspectives into how to tackle a given problem and what there is to do.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's cool. It's funny. Like, and for those of you who don't know the acronym, DS is Director Sportif. It's the French term for sports director, effectively, and it's the person who runs the team on a day-to-day basis. As differentiated,
It's what you'd call a coach in most other sports.
That's true.
Um,
That's true. True indeed.
it's the angry guy with the clipboard, except for there's no clipboard and it's just a car horn.
Yeah, just a foghorn or at a radio, right?
Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. So cool, man. It's super cool. Well, let's talk about format. I mean, just in terms of what we're gonna talk through, what the episodes will probably look like. We want to we're already starting to run a little bit long here. It'll be funny to see like, how this edits down once we, have Riverside like run through and like take out all the extra the dead space potentially, even though I don't think there is that much. Um, it'll be interesting to see or like highlight for our potential listeners. What is the show, maybe going to look like? How are we going to get through in like a half hour episode every couple of weeks? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it should be fairly similar to how this episode's run so far. A little bit of an intro, a little bit of a what's up, what's new in the world, right? Probably talk about what we've done on the bike recently, what's up on tap, if there's any racing going on, a little bit of a synopsis there. And then diving into, a guest intro or intro on the topic we're going to cover. And then yeah, I think just diving into that conversation, full steam ahead, and yeah, I don't know what else you've got in mind, but that's at least probably the first half of any given show.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. No, for sure. I mean, I think it'll be interesting to format the particular conversations, right? And it'll be interesting to see what our guests want to talk about, right? Because especially if they have a background in endurance athletics or sport in general, or they're coming to the conversation more from a business performance standpoint, and maybe they're comparing and contrasting or like helping us build these metaphors and frameworks that we really like to use, as endurance athletes in business. I think it'll be interesting to see how those conversations evolve, and I think that we're probably looking to get through the first 20 minutes of the show with that overall conversation, those topics that are brought to us by our guests, and really we want to hear from our listeners too, right? As people start to pick up the show, check it out. It would be super fun to hear what people want to hear about, whether that be sport focused, whether it be business focused. And I think it allows you to maybe get a nice balance of the two subjects at the same time and how they inform each other. So that's what we're trying to do, is blend our professional and personal lives here a little bit, and tie those passions together. So it'll be cool to see. One thing that I'm super into, and this is just again like speaks to the framework aspect of things. I wanna get crazy with like acronym frameworks. So it's like or like the speed round, right? So it'll be kind of cool to work with our guests or work with listeners to create some potential acronyms. Like I was thinking like sweat or like work, right? Like and or train, as like these potential acronyms, and we can just make those up as we go, and depending on a person's expertise, kind of speak to those various points, and maybe even come out with some pretty fresh, informative new frameworks for people as we actually work with our audience and also with our guests. And I think that'll be super cool if some gems come out of it. So pretty rad.
yeah, absolutely. And then I mean, always sort of wrap up with a bit of a conclusion. Right, the thing we all learn in high school writing. Set up the next episode, the sequel, the next stage, right? Whatever we'll call it, the cool down. Right, and maybe tee up the next guest, tee up the next topic, and give a sense of what's up next.
Yeah, yeah, and what I think will be cool is like as we have these guests on, also hearing from them, what call outs they have or particular recommendations that they might have in terms of other content out there that people can check out, or how they can get in touch directly with them, and keep the engagement going after the episode. So looking forward to that. I think, just putting that framework there for this episode, and, kind of like thinking about it, should be able to inform the production of future episodes. And I'm excited to get into it with you, man. It's going to be super cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
And I mean, I'm going to keep making my analogies, right? You come up with a pre-stage plan, and we're going to get into any given episode, and something's going to get thrown out the window.
It's gonna be like, it's gonna rival Chris Horner's book, right? Like, it's like race tactics. Like, it's awesome. I think this is a cool point to just kind of call out. Like, let's think about the future, right? And just, in terms of like a dream guest, for me, like, I would love to like have, I've met him before a couple of times, like spend a little bit of time with him, but I would love to get Simon Motrin of Rafa on, just because, not a professional cyclist, right, but somebody who's built a company from scratch, right, who kind of took their professional career, that was a successful professional career in marketing and selling, right, and move that into the cycling space, and kind of like built a very, very successful business. So I'd love to like have Simon on at some point in the future. Like, I would check that out. But what about you, man? Who's your dream guest?
I think the first thing I think about is, some of the people that are still active in the professional community, or recently out of the professional cycling world. And thinking about it a lot, there's a lot of the women that have come up, that are currently active, that came from a professional, not non-cycling professional background, and came to the sport a little bit later, or have since gone on to some great things. Thinking of the one who is leading the pack for the Americans right now, Kristen Faulkner, who came out of VC, and I think has since gotten bored with just being a cyclist and gone back to some VC work, from what I've heard. So thinking about that, again, the VC and startup nature was in the water growing up, and there are a lot of the people that come out of the startup world in NorCal that I think we'll have on in the future. But thinking about someone who would be on that dream guest level, I think Kristen stands out a bit, especially because she infamously is nerdy on her tech, so much so that she got thrown out of Strada Bianca earlier this year for wearing a CGM. And
That's right.
There's some appreciation for that.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's super cool. Yeah, it's like, again, we can get into the politics of like UCI consistency on all of this too.
Yeah.
Right. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Jason, I'm stoked. I honestly am super thrilled to just like have, met you, like connected up, like created this relationship, and like we're working through this, like in terms of like creating this content for our community. And honestly, I think we're going to get into some crazy stuff, like in terms of like maybe, doing some video on like actual bike rides at some point, and like, trying to do like maybe some audio from the road, without endangering ourselves.
Exactly. Little do they know, Zwift has an entire market of podcasting right here.
Exactly. Sponsor and digital sponsorship call, like.
Yeah, exactly. Get call outs for GoPro and Zwift and whoever else wants to make this possible.
Yeah, it'd be super fun. That's rad. DJI, we just get like like an army of drones, like. Rad. Well, very cool. So, just a shout out to our listeners. Our first listeners, our 0 level listeners. If you're an endurance
friends and
athlete,
family listeners.
Yeah, friends and family. Like, my wife. Like, if you're an endurance athlete, or you're passionate about business, fitness and performance, right? Any of those aspects, whether it be physical fitness and performance or business fitness and performance, and you'd like to be a guest, like let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And also, we're going to be working to do a new episode right now. We're going to be shooting for every 2 weeks. So we're going to put ourselves on the hook for that. Kind of bring some fire around that, and really bring you stories of performance, endurance, and fitness in business and sport. That's the goal here. Jason, any parting words or shout outs before we jump?
No, I mean, I think, if you're someone interested in the space, or the intersection of two spaces, and if we'd love to have you as a listener. We'd probably love to have you as a guest, right? Anyone who's got an interesting framework, that's somewhat endurance sports related and somewhat business related. I think we'd love to hear it. It's something I love talking about. It's something Drew and I love talking about together. So, happy to start bringing these conversations to light, and making ourselves accountable for having them.
Killer. Awesome. Thanks again, everybody. Drew Noel, Jason Saltzman. We appreciate everybody listening. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Revenue Riders, out. Nice, dude. We did it.
There you go. We